Hi, my name is Marcia Lehman, and I am a Knox County Master Gardener. Today, we're going to talk about the basic rules of pruning, and this is one of the first videos in our Prune Like a Pro series for 2021. We're going to talk about basic rules of pruning today without really going into any of the details of specific plants. So you want to watch this video and a second one, which is on basic tools, before you start watching the individual videos of how to prune individual plants. Let's start with, why do we prune? You can hear about 3Ds or 4Ds, and sometimes people add a fifth, but the 4Ds are anything that's dead, anything that is diseased, anything that is damaged, and anything that is dysfunctional. Those things can be pruned at any time of year because they are problems. So if you see dead, diseased, damaged, or dysfunctional branches, limbs, whatever, take them off as soon as you see them. You don't have to wait for the right time of year. We also prune to maintain the size of the plant. And we jokingly say you want to stay one step ahead of KUB. KUB is Knoxville Utility Board, and I'm not making them out to be the bad guy, but if you have the wrong sized shrubs or trees planted under a power line, they will come in and they will prune it the way they need to prune it for the power line, which may not be the way you want to prune it for the tree or shrub you're trying to grow. So if you can stay ahead of them and manage the size of those things that were probably should not have been planted under a power line, you can at least avoid the pruning job that KUB might do. We often prune to control the growth and shape of a plant. We also do it to improve the flowering for those that are flowering shrubs, as well as for fruit production, and then for the foliage. The primary reason that I prune and that we recommend you prune is to increase the airflow and sunlight into the middle of the plant. So many times you see a shrub that the middle of it or the back side of it where it butts up against the house has just died out, or all you have left is hardwood and no foliage. It's because sunlight didn't get to those parts of the plant, or there wasn't good enough airflow. And then not to be overlooked is the convenience and or your safety when you are walking through your lawn or mowing the lawn, or we often see things planted along a driveway, which the last thing you want to do is scratch your car. Those are some of the things that fall into the fourth D of dysfunctional. And as I say, anything that is one of the 4Ds can be pruned at any time of year. As soon as you see them, get rid of them. Before you start, do an inventory. Make a list of all the plants that you have. Mark the ones that need to be pruned, because not every plant needs to be pruned unless something got diseased, damaged, has died, or has become dysfunctional. There are many plants that, as long as they're growing healthily, you don't need to do a thing. You can confirm the recommended pruning season a number of ways. You can check trusted resources, and we always like to refer people to the Extension Service publications. Those publications that come from educational institutions, and particularly with ornamental plants, any one of the better known botanical gardens usually has excellent reference material on their website. So the way you can make your Google search much better, Google or whatever search engine you're using, but do your search on how to prune, fill in the blank, forsythia, crepe myrtle, rhododendron, and add either the word extension, which will get you Extension Service pubs, or .edu, which will get you papers and publications from educational institutions. And then finally, you can add the term botanical garden, which will get you some of the better botanical garden documents. You can also call Ask a Master Gardener, which is a service offered through the Extension Office, at 865-215-2340. Most of the time, you'll get an answering box, and try and leave a detailed question. your question will get routed to a master gardener, and that person will research it as best he or she can based on the details you gave. If they're not clear what you're asking, they're likely to call you back and ask some additional questions, and then they'll research it and get back to you. As you proceed through this, it always helps, A, to have a plan, and sometimes that plan gets created as you're actually going through, but keep a calendar and or a journal. And so if in March you pruned your figs, well, make a note of when you pruned it, and then next year, set a reminder for March of next year as that it's probably time to go prune those figs again. If you're pruning forsythia after they bloom, you know, mark the date on the calendar of when they finished blooming and when you pruned them. Keep a journal if you're a journal type person. I happen to be a calendar type person, and so I set automatic reminders that pop up a week or so before I probably need to do the pruning that just says, start to watch the weather, go check the plants and see if they're starting to put out buds or if they're about to leaf out if we get another week of really warm weather. So I like the calendar approach, but use whatever works for you. And once you've developed a calendar of January through December and your pruning activities, or you've kept a journal for a year or two, you now have an ongoing plan of what you need to do annually. And of course, you'll update it as you add plants to your inventory or as you remove plants from your inventory. What do you need to record on this journal? Well, again, list all the plants you have. Make a note if they need to be pruned or not to be pruned, because sometime you may say, oh, gee, I forgot to put this on the calendar. Well, it may be that it doesn't need to be pruned, and that's why it's not on your calendar. Highlight if they need light pruning or heavy pruning. Some things, if regularly maintained, like rhododendrons, you're typically cutting off the prior year's blossom, and that's what you're taking off. You're not going back further into the shrub unless you have one of the 4 Ds. So it doesn't need a light pruning or a heavy pruning. Focus on thinning for getting sunlight and air into the middle of it. And you may be pruning to improve the shape or to improve the flowering. Document when those flowering shrubs bloom. Do they bloom on old wood, which really means it was last year's wood, or does it bloom on new wood, which is the current year's wood? And my 2 sentinel plants for remembering this are the forsythia, because almost everybody recognizes that, and the crepe myrtle. So let me take the forsythia because it blooms early in the spring. It's one of the first things that comes out. We love those lovely yellow flowers. It blooms on old wood. It blooms on wood that grew last year. So that wood grew last year. It put all the buds on it. It blooms in the spring, and then you're going to prune it after it's done flowering. Now, if it blooms on new wood, which is what a crepe myrtle does, it blooms much later. It typically blooms after July 1. So all those blooms are on new wood. So that means that while it's dormant, which in East Tennessee usually means we need to wait until January or so. Yes, it may get cold in December, but doesn't get cold and stay cold, and the crepe myrtle isn't completely dormant. So wait until it's truly dormant, which is usually January, and then go out and prune it. And then when it comes out of dormancy and it starts new growth, that's where all the flowers will be for the current year. So old wood is not ancient wood, it's just 1-year-old wood, and new wood is less than 1 year. And then record the suggested best time to prune. Now, when you do some of those Google searches, if they say, for instance, on roses, prune before they leaf out in the spring, that's a good recommendation, and that works regardless of where you are. But if you pick up a publication from somewhere on the West Coast and it says prune in March, well, March may not be the best time for us. So the publications that give you times, not in specific months, but relative to what's going on with the plant, the ones that give you prune when about to leaf out are much better, much more reliable for transporting from one region of the US to East Tennessee. But make a note of what the best time to prune is, what time has worked best for you when you've pruned, and then that journal that you're keeping comes in really handy. What else do you need to record? You need to know the basic nature or the form of the plant. And these fall into a couple of categories. There are plants that grow from canes. And again, this is where the forsythia falls. It is a cane plant. It puts out lots of canes. The butterfly bush, nandina, red twig dogwood, even the elderberry, the blueberry, the raspberry, the blackberry, those are all cane plants. So there's a particular way that we will be pruning cane plants. So if your plant has the nature of canes, then it gets pruned one way, as opposed to plants that have a mounding habit. Those are things like the abelia, the azalea, juniper, holly, lavender, snowberry. They get pruned another way. Then there are plants that are tree-like shrubs. And this is where the rhododendron and the crepe myrtle, photinia, star magnolia, and the like fall. And last but not least, there are plants that are used as a hedge, and they fall into a category all their own. But these are more often privet, boxwood, yew, laurel. So I think everybody knows what a hedge looks like, and you've probably also seen places where a hedge was made out of some other type of plant, and it just doesn't look natural. And one of my favorites was I saw a hedge made out of forsythia, and I felt so sorry for those forsythia bushes, because you should never try and make a hedge out of forsythia. It's a cane plant, not a hedge plant. So get to know the natural form of the plant that you have on your property. So then we're going to prune according to the form. So those things that grow like canes, like the classic forsythia. This is a great example. It's in a space that's big enough for it. But the first thing you want to do is go in and address the 4 Ds. If you've got any dead, diseased, damaged, or dysfunctional, and dysfunctional for something like in this picture would be if you had one of those branches that was coming out and was going to whack the person mowing the lawn or trying to mulch around this plant, you may get rid of that. But every year after the flowering has finished, you will go in and remove the older canes. And the ones that you're removing, you're going to take off as low as you possibly can. You want to cut that cane stem almost, as close to the ground as you can get it. And in effect, you want to keep that plant looking like a 5 to 6 year old plant. So every year you're going to go in and take out some of the older canes and let the younger canes grow and keep it looking like a 5 or 6 year old plant. Now, if you're a homeowner and you've recently moved and you inherited one that wasn't getting attention for several years, many of these cane growing shrubs, when they need a renovation, you can actually cut it back very close to the ground. I mean, just whack it down to about 6 inches above the ground. And yes, it'll look like a stump for a very short period of time, and then it will start to grow again. And then you can do this removal of older canes, and it'll take you 2 to 3 years before it looks full again. But you can easily renovate any of the cane growing shrubs. But you should never shear a caning shrub. That means never take those hedge trimmers and just go around and give it a haircut. You're going in to remove canes, take them all the way to the ground. And if it's getting too tall, you will go in and do selective pruning, but you will never pick up a pair of hedge shears to work on a cane growing shrub. If it's a mounding plant, like an azalea, again, never shear a mounding plant. If you take a pair of shears to something like this azalea, keep in mind that pruning triggers new growth. So on the end of all those stems that you pruned, you're going to get rapid growth, and you end up with what I call moonshots, where you've got this long branch that sticks way out, and then you go in and you have to cut that off again. So just avoid that by never taking hedge shears to a mounding plant. Go in and start by addressing the 4Ds. And then if you need to trim it back a bit because it's gotten too tall or too wide, then you grab the longest branches that are either on the side or on the top, and you trim them back to a third or a half of their size. But you're going deep into the bush to make that cut. You're not going all the way to the bottom like on the canes, but you will trim them back to a third or a half deep in the bush. And then when you've finished doing that, to get the height back to where you want it, you can go in and selectively thin additional branches to improve airflow and sunlight. Just keep in mind that you never really want to remove more than 1/3 of the vegetative growth. Most plants can take easily a 20 to 25%. These plants can take about a 30%, but never take more than that on a mounding plant. The tree-like shrubs. This is where crepe myrtle and rhododendron, as shown in the two pictures, come in. Again, the first thing you want to do is go address the 4Ds. Remove any suckers that are growing up from the bottom around the base of the plant. Never, 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 never just come in and top off the plant. On crepe myrtles, we call this crepe murder. And I'm sure you've all seen examples of it and you wonder why people do it. And it is a classic, well, the folks down the street do it or their lawn service did it, so it must be okay. The only good news is that crepe myrtle trees, shrubs, are really hardy. They can take a beating and keep on going. So just don't do crepe myrtle. You've all seen those plants that come up, and in the winter when they've lost all their leaves, they have these fist-looking things at the top of their stems. And then you get all the water shoots and many, many more stems, and you've created a maintenance nightmare. You can recover, but that's going to be a couple-year process. Similarly to never topping, never remove the leader. When you look at a crepe myrtle, you can tell which is the tallest stem coming up, and never remove that. The tall one, the leader, puts out a hormone that controls the growth of all the ones that are slightly lower than that. So if you remove the leader, the other ones say, hey, the leader's gone, it's my turn to be the leader. And now you've got this competition among all those other lateral shoots, and you'll get some really crazy looking growth. And now you've got an annual maintenance chore that you could have avoided. So on these, you want to selectively prune. When you're pruning, you want to prune back to a side branch or a main stem. And on things like crepe myrtle, this is an excellent example in the bottom right. You want to keep usually about 3 main stems, get rid of any of the crossing rubbing branches. And once they're the size of these in the photo, they really need very little pruning. Rhododendrons, as I mentioned before, don't need a lot of pruning. They don't need heavy pruning. Just go in and take off last year's blossoms. So you're taking off 1 year's worth of growth. And cleaning up the 4Ds, periodically reaching down in and pruning something to increase airflow and sunlight. For those hedges, these are often privet, boxwood, yew, sometimes laurel. Again, we start with the 4Ds, get rid of any of the 4Ds. And here is the primary point to remember. The base should always be wider than the top. And the reason for that is you want the base to also get sunlight. So if you look at this diagram down here in the bottom right, this one, which is labeled right, the base is wider, and so all these branches get sunlight. Whereas this one, which is accentuated a little bit. More often than not, people just try and square them off, but this one actually has the base being narrower for purposes of demonstration. The top of that plant actually casts shade down on the bottom of the plant. And what you'll find is the foliage will tend to fall off, and what you then see is bare wood. And this is what often happens in foundation plantings. If you've got mounting things, most people go for what I call this as a meatball. But the problem with the meatball is that the bottom is much narrower than this part, and therefore it doesn't get sunlight. And so over a number of years, you're going to lose the foliage because it doesn't get any sunshine. And then you've got bare wood sticking out in the bottom. Now, if you like meatballs or lollipops, then go with that style. But the better format is to, if you want a mound, is to keep the base wider than the top. This is the one place that you will use shears, and you are cutting back close to the point where last year's growth started. So granted, these things get planted, the shrubs are small, you give them a couple years to grow, and then once you start pruning, you're really taking off how much grew since the last time I pruned. So you can shear lightly multiple times during the year, or you can shear heavily and then maybe not have quite as neat and clean as it starts to put out new growth. But stop shearing about Labor Day. And the reason for that is, again, pruning triggers growth. And if you're pruning about Labor Day, you need 6 to 8 weeks for that new growth to harden off and not get frozen when the temperatures drop. So 8 weeks from Labor Day, which is somewhere around September 7th, is going to put us at November 7th. And that's about the time that we're having our first frost. It's not a hard freeze, but if you stop at Labor Day, you will have gotten 6 to 8 weeks of reasonable growth, time to harden off, and then when the truly cold temperatures come, you will not be losing that new tender growth to a freeze. So light shearing throughout the year, taking off however much has grown since the last time you sheared. And then every few years, put on your long sleeved gloves and go in and selectively thin the inside of this hedge to improve airflow and sunlight. So what do we want to record? Well, when to prune. So we talked about plants that bloom on old wood. That is the prior year's growth. And in East Tennessee, these tend to be the flowering shrubs that bloom in the spring and early summer, and generally before July 1. This is one of those places where if you find a publication from another state, they may say, well, it's a June 1 date in their area. But for East Tennessee, these things tend to bloom before July 1. So again, these are the forsythia, the azalea, and some hydrangeas. We will do a separate video just on pruning hydrangeas later in the series, but some hydrangea bloom on whole wood. Here's the important part though. You need to do this pruning 6 to 8 weeks after flowering. So in your journal, note when it starts to flower. What I like to do is note when the first flowers come out. I note, when about 90% of the flowers have dropped. And then within 4 weeks of most of those flowers being down, I have pruned these things. Now, why is that important? It's important because 6 to 8 weeks after these things flower, they start to set the buds for next year. So if my forsythia finishes blooming in late April, then by late May, I will be pruning it because that 6 to 8 week period is going to fall in early June when it's going to start setting buds for the following spring. So if I, get busy doing something else and I don't prune this thing until July or August, I will actually be cutting off buds for the following year. So these things that bloom on old wood need almost a year's worth of growth to put out those flowers the following year. So it's 6 to 8 weeks after flowering, but that's really 6 to 8 weeks after they start flowering. and why I like to use 4 weeks after they're almost done flowering, because some of these things will bloom for quite a while. So I like to track when the first flowers pop, and then I like to record when I'm down to just a handful of flowers, I'd say 10% flowers remaining. And then within 4 weeks of that point, I am pruning these things that bloom on old wood so that they have nearly a year to grow that wood for the following year. So those are the old wood things. They bloom on the prior year's growth. Then we have the plants that bloom on new wood, which is the same year's growth. And these tend to bloom after July 1 in East Tennessee, and definitely includes the crepe myrtle and some of the other hydrangeas. And these are things that we prune while dormant. So these get pruned January, February, and if it stays cold long enough, you might be able to delay it into early March, but not much beyond that. Then the plants that are used as a hedge, they typically get pruned while they're actively growing. So you can start pruning those, some of the boxwood, in March, and then touch them up as you get the little sprigs growing out the side, March through August, but stop by Labor Day so the new growth has time to harden off. I think it should become apparent why you want to keep that calendar or that journal, because the weather conditions are not the same every year, but they are a pretty good guideline. Then some basic pruning techniques. We talked about the 4 Ds: dead, diseased, damaged, dysfunctional. Also, know what the plant should look like. So again, a Google search can show you what a forsythia will look like. Because when you buy it, it's a couple little canes in a 1-gallon pot. Who knew that it was going to get 6 feet tall and 6 feet wide? And that it was going to send sprays out left, right. Know what that plant should look like when it's mature and after it's been pruned. So don't ask a plant to be something it's not. This is where I say, you know, when I saw a row of forsythia that were pruned as a hedge, it's like, forsythia like to spray. They're canes. Why would you try and use a caning plant as a hedge? That's not natural. And on crepe myrtles, you know, everybody says, oh, it's such a dirty plant, it drops all those seed pods. Well, crepe myrtles are dirty plants. Don't ask it to be a neat and clean plant. So don't put it somewhere that you, like next to a sidewalk, because you will end up with seed pods all over your sidewalk or all over your driveway. Or if you park your car in your driveway, yeah, you're going to have them all over your car. Don't ask that plant or shrub to be what it's not. Know what it looks like when it's mature and know what it looks like when it's properly pruned. A general rule of thumb is after you've addressed the 4 Ds, start at the bottom and on the inside, thin out the middle, keep thinking about the airflow and letting sunshine into the middle. If you've got those moonshots on a caning plant, those are the ones that you go in and cut off way down at the ground. And if it's a moonshot on a mounding plant, then you cut it back deep inside the bush. Make proper cuts. Please, please, please only use shears on hedges. Do not use shears on caning plants or mounding plants. Use the right tool and make proper cuts. And don't remove more than 1/4 to 1/3 of the plant material. So if you're looking at it before you start, think about, if I cut this whole thing down, how big of a pile of debris would I have? And as you do your pruning, then the pile of debris you are actually accumulating should be no more than 1/4 to 1/3 of that mental picture you had of the entire thing as a pile of debris. Talking about making proper cuts. For the shrubs that have buds and leaves that alternate, which means you have one on the right, then you go up a little bit, and you have one on the left, and you go up a little bit more, you have another one on the right, go up a little bit, you got one on the left. These first 4 apply to alternating. So you want a nice 45-degree cut. Here's our bud. We want the bottom of that cut to be about the middle of that bud. We definitely want the upper part of this cut above the bud. This is a good 45-degree cut. This one, you can say, well, gee, yeah, it's about the middle of the bud. What's wrong with it? The problem is it's too angular, and as a result, you've got this much wound area. This area is easily twice the area of this cut. So the key is that a 45-degree cut gives you not the least, but the best amount of wound. This one is too low. This bud is not going to survive because the cut is below the bottom of the bud. So you're going to be back in a year making a cut somewhere down here again because this part's likely to die. This one is too high and it is too flat. I mean, a perfectly flat cut would give you the minimal area, but it allows water to collect on top of it, so that's not good. Whereas the 45-degree cut, if water hits this, it's likely to run off. So this may have the minimal wound area. This one is the second best or second smallest wound area, but it is actually the best because any moisture that may collect there is not going to sit there and start to rot. It will run off. This example is a good cut on an opposite budding. And my top of mind example for this is elderberry. Instead of alternating left up a little bit to the right, up a little bit to the left, here the leaves and buds come out directly opposite each other. And these can actually be harder to prune because imagine that you're pruning not just to a bud, but back to a branch. And you've got to get your pruners between those two branches and make a nice clean cut. So these can be a little more challenging, but this is an example of a good opposite cut. So most pruning cuts, most selective pruning cuts are made with pruners for smaller branches and loppers for bigger branches. And shears are only used on hedges. So let's summarize. When we prune, we want to take care of the 4 Ds first: dead, diseased, damaged, dysfunctional. We want to start at the bottom. We want to prune for air and sunshine because that contributes to plant health. Keep a calendar or a journal, and remember that the old wood flowering shrubs usually bloom before July 1, and the new wood flowering shrubs usually bloom after July 1. Keep in mind the 1/3 rule for how much you can remove. If you have hedges, remember they should be wider at the bottom than the top. And make sure you use the right tools. So whereas this is a basic rules of pruning short video, there's a separate one called basic tools, which will highlight the tools to use. And then we will have a whole series of pruning videos on specific plants. And I can assure you hydrangeas will be among them. Thank you for tuning in today.